So playing games has attractions for many of us, from vast open worlds to explore incredible stories, breathtaking bleeding edge graphics and beyond. No matter what your particular poison is, there is something for everyone. Of all the games, all the platforms, all the ways to play, they all share a distinct challenge to overcome: visual quality and input control. Now, there are two key areas where the PC platform can excel: high refresh rates over 144, 360 Hz and even higher, ultra low latency input times and response control, choices exclusive to the format by and large, but they can be demanding to achieve. One misconception of the PC space is that just lowering settings or resolution can enable all players to hit high frame rates and low latency. Not true. Even within 3 generations of Nvidia's RTX family of cards, we have a wealth of new hardware, architecture and bespoke features that offer significant benefits within the RTX 40 cards as opposed to the older 30 and 20 series. Taking a popular card in the RTX 2070, which was the first range of RTX cards, ushering in ray tracing hardware, acceleration, dedicated machine learning hardware in those tensor cores which powered the industry-leading temporal reconstruction image models in deep learning super sampling, better known as Dlss. Now, over the years, this technology has evolved, both in software and hardware. With the RTX 40 range, the Tensor RT and CUDA cores, the architecture itself, power use, memory subsystem, and more have been improved and expanded to increase speeds, quality, and choice for the audience. Now, these break down into 4 key pillars that are either exclusive to the 40 series or significantly better on those cards due to the hardware benefits within that design. DLSS 3 image and ray reconstruction, powered by improved tensor cores. RT cores that deliver 2x increases on ray tracing calculations over the previous generation. Reflex Plus low latency software to shorten the time from each click or slash to screen. And DLSS 3 frame generation, which can increase refresh rates by 2 or 3 times even when CPU bound. Now, when it comes to interactive media such as games, whether you know it or not, you can feel the impact of slow response on your actions. The faster the response from your character shooting or jumping after you've pressed the button, the better the game will feel. But game engines are complex, and there is a great deal of work for the engine, CPU, GPU, memory and screen to do in between each of those clicks and screen update. The on-screen visual shows you a high level of that mouse click through the hardware, the game engine, and then out to screen. The high level, the CPU needs to process the input into an action, create a draw request for the required effect or animation and sound effect into that render queue. This is then passed to the GPU to draw on screen through the relevant commands and memory systems required. Finally, this is pushed out via the display port or HDMI connection and updated on your screen. Most screens run at 60 Hz, which for ease means a new frame will be shown every 16.67 milliseconds, and this aligns to the time that entire render pipeline must process, calculate and draw the frame to screen. The longer or shorter this pipeline or refresh is, the slower or faster your wait will be to see your results manifest on the screen. Now, many engines and developers can integrate a buffer, a small queue of frames rendered ahead of time to help reduce delays in that render process. Now, this means frames are delivered in a balanced cadence, like a drum beat. The downside of this is that input latency can be extended, as the frame of your actions can be X frames longer before it hits the screen within that pipeline. Now, this is where Nvidia's reflex technology can help. A set of APIs that developers can incorporate into their game engine via a software development kit, and this helps the game's engine's render process best align to the fastest output on screen. Nvidia Reflex improves 2 key areas. The buffered frame queue is reduced to 0 to ensure that only the latest frame is in flight, and the input polling from the player is delayed to the latest point in that frame creation pipeline, resulting in only the latest frame being used when input polling is taken from the user and any buffered frames are dropped, improving CPU workloads and ensuring you feel the benefits of that faster response. It also has a boost mode, which does draw more GPU power by keeping the clock rates as fast as possible so that any CPU delays can be mitigated by a faster GPU render time. Now these are the two modes you will see later in the results, showing reflex and boost times. But talk is cheap, and results are what matter in those games we play. Now, putting all this to the test, using that first generation RTX 2070 card pitted against the RTX 40 Super, a high-end card, to see if the paper specs translate to real-world boosts. Now, I'm using a high-end, neon-powered, pre-built CyberPower machine with some meaty specifications to get the job done. You can see them all on screen right now. Now, this provides a controlled test for us to isolate just the GPU with all of the components being identical, removing any influencing factors. Now, to ensure we get the very best quality, we're using an Asus ROG Swift 360Hz G-Sync monitor to ensure we have the highest refresh possible from each game. For latency testing, the G-Sync module in the screen monitors our mouse clicks and captures the relevant pixel change on screen, such as the muzzle flash. And with the menu, we can see the end-to-end latency time it took that click to present on screen, the entire system latency. In addition, using my own latency testing setup, I capture the screen using a high frame rate capture with an LED attached to the input device, be that a keyboard, mouse or controller, and using both methods I can collate and compare, giving an accurate sample of the time each action from click to photon, tracking the improvement across each setting, GPU and game tested. Now, to ensure we are more GPU weighted, each game will be tested at 2560 by 1440 and then moved to DLSS quality. We present a fair comparison across the GPUs at common resolutions for high refresh PC gaming. We start at native screen resolution, unlock frame rates, no DLSS or reflex technology enabled. We track the input latency to the screen from an attack, giving us a baseline to work with on both the RTX 2070 and then the RTX 4080 Super, and we take multiple samples and present the median for each of those. So let's get clicking. Now, as a recent PlayStation release on PC that boosts far higher image quality and frame rates than were possible on PS5, the thing to remember here is the faster the game's underlying frame time, the lower the input latency should be. As such, it's no surprise that the RTX 40 Super is significantly faster out of the gate, as it can run the game at higher frame rates, but the baseline is relative to each card. Native 1440p no reflex is slow, 136 milliseconds median. Enabling reflex, we see a decent 12% improvement, down to 121.4. Reflex boost puts more pressure on the GPU, which it really doesn't have capacity for, and we see identical median times. Now, enabling DLSS quality mode can offer, in conjunction with the reflex technology, almost identical visual quality, more on that later, but we almost break the 100 millisecond barrier now with a further 11.48%, hitting a low of 108.9 milliseconds median. Now, high refresh rates can really help, and here the RTX 4080 Super shows how much this can add as it can stretch its legs and the engine. Now we are 51% faster, like for like, 66.8 as a starting baseline at 1440p. Reflex on, we see a 10% reduction down to 60.58, and then no real change with boost, which aligns to the CPU being more capable to feed the GPU. Enabling DLSS quality mode, we gain a further 7.7% on that, hitting a 56.4 median low, which nets us a smaller 18.4% reduction from top to bottom. Reflex and DLSS offer close levels of benefits, but as the RTX 2070 is starting from a much slower base, over 200% slower than the RTX 4080 Super, it gains more in percentage but is overall significantly worse in time, even with all options enabled over the RTX 4080 Super at native 1440. Now, this presents the visual impact a game's rendering rate can also have compared to the native panel refresh. At 360Hz, the RTX 4080 is much closer to that level of refresh than the 2070, which presents far more ghosting, noise, and general image issues due to the hold and display methods of all mod screens. But more on that later. A recent and impressive game from new studio Game Science. This uses high quality rendering and ray tracing, which will favour the RTX 4080 Super far more. As such, we will remain at 1440p for this latency test and will disable ray tracing so we give the RTX 2070 a fighting chance. Now, the same methods as before, aside reflex, as this game does not support reflex within the menu. However, it does use it in conjunction with DLSS 3 frame generation and is a requirement for that technology, which is exclusive to the RTX 40 series of cards. At native 1440p, we have a high 121 milliseconds of median input latency on the RTX 4080 Super. We gain a minuscule 5.5% moving to DLSS quality, 114 milliseconds now, as the game is heavily GPU memory bound in this Unreal Engine 5 powered title. But with DLSS 3 frame generation enabled, we see a huge boost to the game's refresh rate, moving into 120 FPS plus, but only a minor hit to input times of less than 2% at 116. Now, as the GPU can complete that interpolated frame very quickly due to the architecture being designed to support it, with this card though and DLSS quality frame generation, we can now enable maximum ray tracing cinematic settings running over 100 FPS with a small increase to input latency than native 1440p without ray tracing, 127 milliseconds, within 5% in fact. The RTX 2070 does not fare as well here, with ray tracing not viable due to the high GPU load, meaning we have a much higher 1440p baseline that reduces slightly with DLSS quality, 300 milliseconds medium at native 1440p and 273 using DLSS quality. Both versions are sub 20 or 30 respectively, which is a big cause for such low input times. This is the biggest gap I saw in my tests, over 60% faster input times on the RTX 4080 Super at native 1440p, and even with maximum settings, ray tracing on very high and frame generation enabled, we are still over 53% faster input times at 127 milliseconds. A night and day difference between these two cards, and highlights two key benefits. Much smoother and more responsive game, along with improved image quality and clarity using DLSS 3 frame generation, can help improve even if you lack the CPU or GPU power to hit those higher rates, but it can only run on RTX 40 series GPUs.
Major Sarkana, 8th Cadian Regiment.
Major, give me an update.
Now, 3 more titles close out this test bed. A hugely CPU-bound title in Space Marine 2 shows that this is not the case on the RTX 2070, where the game is far more often GPU-bound, certainly at 1440p. At the same resolution, the RTX 4080 Super is 28.9% faster, 65 millisecond versus 92 as a median, but with DLSS quality enabled, that gap shrinks as it gives more time back to the 2070, but it just makes the RTX 4080 work faster in less time. It's still around 18% faster, but as this game has no reflex or frame generation technology, we are limited by the CPU beyond 130 FPS. The remaining duo are the fastest here and are closest across the board. Brand new Call of Duty Black Ops 6 can leap up 71% going from native 1440p with all the bells and whistles on, then moving to DLSS quality Reflex Plus, we hit a low of 35 milliseconds on the RTX 4080. The RTX 2070 is still slower, but still great in a game known for its excellent gun combat and control, but struggles at native 1440p here, yet manages a fast 80.9 milliseconds, which reduces to a low of 58 milliseconds, some 39%, with every latency option enabled. Finally, the shooter that refuses to die sees unbelievable input times, 12.8 milliseconds on the RTX 2070 and 8 milliseconds at best on the RTX 4080 Super, as both cards are largely GPU bound still on this cyber power monster machine. They still benefit into the double digits with reflex and upscalers enabled. So we've covered the gamut of methods you can improve and enhance your PC gaming experience, both with far lower input times and faster responses, but also increase frame rates in conjunction with improving or minimizing the visual impact quality of the games played using DLSS and Nvidia reflex technologies, paired with the latest PC hardware such as this Cyber Power RTX 4080 Super desktop machine. And it is thanks to CyberPower UK for providing this neon-lit, transparent, pre-built PC that powered us through this test. They offer custom builds across all needs and price ranges, and the quality and performance is always top tier. You can find their selection via the links below. Now, as I've covered in this video, high refresh rates require more than just a powerful GPU, as the CPU can quickly become the bottleneck. Even with top-tier gaming CPUs in this Ryzen 9 7950X3D, almost the best CPU you can buy, can still become the limiting factor once we optimize the game towards 144 to 240 FPS plus frame rates. This is where frame generation really starts to make sense, as when the game is running at high frame times alongside Dlss and reflex low latency enabled, any cost from the generated and buffered frames introduced by DLSS 3 frame generation is mitigated to a negligible factor. The potential 360Hz output this Asus screen can offer is higher than even this mighty machine can hit on modern games, Counter-Strike 2 being the exception. But with the collection of powerful hardware, Nvidia low latency reflex integration, DLSS frame reconstruction and generation, we can enable ray tracing, high visual quality, and still hit some incredibly high performance targets that make a huge difference to your gameplay and enjoyment.
We are preparing an airstrike. Can you hold the enemy in place until it hits?
And that's it for the deep dive into game technology, GPU comparisons, latency, and all things input related. And we'll catch you on the next one.